My name is Ezra Voss, and I was never supposed to be that far out. My patrol route was a quiet loop through the outer colonies. Boring, routine, the kind of assignment that makes younger officers groan, but that I had quietly come to love. Empty space has a particular kind of silence that you don't find anywhere else. No traffic, no noise, just stars, and the soft hum of my ship's engine and, on good nights, a cup of instant coffee that was terrible, in a way I had grown genuinely fond of. I was on my third cup when my ship's AI, Sable, made a small sound. Not an alarm. More like a polite clearing of a throat that a machine does not have. "Commander Voss," she said, "I am detecting a distress beacon. Low power, fractured signal, 43 million kilometers past your authorized patrol boundary." I looked up from my coffee. "How long has it been broadcasting?" 37 hours. "It has been logged by 2 compact warships, 1 trading vessel, and a border patrol unit. All 4 declined to respond. The compact's triage system has categorized it as a probable false signal." I was quiet for a moment. "Does it have life signs attached?" There was the smallest pause. "Yes, 2 confirmed." I set down my coffee. I want to explain something about distress beacons, because most people who have never worked rescue do not fully understand what they mean. A beacon is not a cry for help from someone who is mildly inconvenienced. A beacon is what you send when everything else has already failed. It is the last door you knock on. 37 hours of knocking. In this case, with no answer from anyone who had the ability to come. That number sat in my chest like a stone. I turned my ship around. Sable immediately noted that this would take us well outside our authorized sector. I told her I was aware of that. She noted that the source of the beacon was in a disputed corridor with a history of raider activity. I told her I was aware of that too. She then, with what I can only describe as the digital equivalent of a sigh, began plotting the most efficient course to the signal's origin, and stopped arguing. That is one of the things I appreciate most about Sable. She always tells me the risks, and then she helps anyway. The wreck came into view 4 hours later, and my first thought was that something had tried to peel it open like a piece of fruit. It was a civilian long hauler, the kind of ship families use for long colony runs, and it was spinning slowly in the middle of a debris field that should not have existed in that part of space. The hull had scorch marks along one entire side, deep ones, the kind left by weapons, not accidents. 2 life signs, Sable confirmed, adult and juvenile. Species, Quethali. Hull integrity is failing. I estimate 4 hours before the breach becomes unsurvivable. What do they breathe? Nitrogen-heavy atmosphere with trace xylene compounds, partially incompatible with your emergency suit. You would need to modify the suit's recirculator before entry, or risk respiratory damage. How long will that take? Approximately 2 hours, if you work without stopping. 2 hours of modification, 4 hours before the breach. I was already moving toward the suit locker before she finished the sentence. I burned my hands twice on improper valve seals. I cracked a knuckle on the helmet ring. I breathed through the discomfort and kept working, because the math only worked if I did not stop. When I finally cut through the long hauler's airlock, I was met by a wall of silence that felt intentional. The lights inside were dim and flickering. The air had a sharp mineral quality that made my eyes water faintly despite the modified suit. And standing in the middle of the corridor, holding a broken hull strut above her head like she intended to use it on whoever came through that door, was the most composed and frightening person I had ever seen. She was tall, even by Quethali standards. Silver-gray plating ran along her neck and shoulders, in overlapping layers that caught the dim light. Her eyes were the deep blue-green of ocean water seen from far above, and they were not frightened. They were calculating. She was deciding whether I was a threat, and she had already decided that it did not matter, because she was going to stand her ground either way. Behind her, a child crouched, smaller, lighter plating, eyes wider and more uncertain. She had both arms wrapped around a data pad, holding it against her chest as though it were the most important thing in the universe. I raised both hands, slowly, palms out. I opened my visor so she could see my face clearly, even though the air quality was not ideal, and I could already feel a faint sting at the back of my throat. "My name is Commander Ezra Voss," I said. "United Earth Rescue Corps. I am not armed. I am here because your beacon found me." The woman did not lower the strut. "Your compact treaty does not cover this sector." "Correct." You have no legal obligation to respond to our signal. Also correct. She watched me with those calculating eyes. Then why are you here? I thought about giving her a longer answer. About the 37 hours. About the 4 ships that had declined. About my grandmother's voice saying that the worst thing a person could do was have the ability to help and choose not to. But all of those things would have taken longer than the truth, so I just said the truth instead. Because you needed help and I was close enough to come. It was not an impressive answer. She knew it. I knew it. But there is a kind of honesty that does not require decoration, and she seemed to recognize it the way all precise people recognize things that are simply and accurately stated. She lowered the strut. Her name was Velthara Koss. Her daughter's name was Selly. I learned Velthara's name gradually, over the hours that followed. I learned Selly's name in approximately 90 seconds, because the girl stepped out from behind her mother, tilted her head at me with the directness of a child who has decided that fear is less interesting than curiosity, and introduced herself with great formality. I am Selly Koss, she said. I am 11 years and 4 cycles. Your skull is very round. I know, I said. It is a common observation. The ship was worse inside than it had looked from outside. The navigation core was burned through. The communications array could broadcast but not receive. The life support was failing in 3 separate ways simultaneously. I went to work with everything I had, which included a repair kit that my supervisor had once called overpacked, and that I had always considered to be exactly right. Selly followed me from room to room and asked questions without pause. She wanted to know about Earth, about whether humans breathed during sleep, about why I had hair when most species did not, and whether I had grown it on purpose. I answered every question I could, because it seemed important to her, and because her questions kept the fear from getting too loud in the room. At one point she asked, "Do all humans come when you call them?" I thought carefully before answering. "Not all," I said. "Some do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know which kind you are?" "You find out when the call comes," I said. "And then you know." She nodded very seriously, as though I had confirmed something she had already suspected. By the time I had the hull breaches patched, I had learned one more thing. Velthara's datapad, the one Selly was still carrying, contained 6 years of ecological research, atmospheric viability studies, soil analysis, migration modeling for several million Kethali people living in overcrowded home systems who needed somewhere better to go. 6 years of patient, careful, important work. And it was sitting in the arms of a child on a broken ship, in a sector that 4 other vessels had decided was not worth a detour. I thought about that for a while. I did not say anything about it, but I thought about it. The raiders came back on the 2nd day. 2 Kethavari skiffs, small, fast, built for ambush, dropped out of skip travel at the edge of my sensor range while I was in the middle of my morning coffee, which I had begun sharing with my passengers, because Sally's reaction to her first taste of it had been one of the more entertaining things I had witnessed in 4 years of deep space patrol. I ran the numbers immediately, because that is what you do. 2 skiffs, probably 4 crew, against 1 underpowered patrol scout with a damaged long hauler in tow. The numbers were not good, so I changed the numbers. It took 40 minutes. I used the debris field's own mass and drift to create a false navigational hazard zone. I used the long hauler's cargo magnetics to project a mass shadow that suggested a much heavier, much more dangerous ship than was actually present. I positioned my ship so that both skiffs were inside my forward railgun's firing arc at the same time. And Sable, working with characteristic efficiency, cracked the raiders' standard communication frequency in just over 4 minutes, and broadcast the navigational hazard alert on their own channel. I did not fire a single shot. The raiders ran their own calculation. They looked at the numbers they had and the numbers I had given them, and they made the only reasonable decision available to them, which was to leave. They were gone in less than 3 minutes. Velthara had watched from the doorway the entire time. When the skiff signatures disappeared from the screen, she said, "You were outnumbered." "Yes. And your solution was to make the problem appear unsolvable, more or less." She was quiet in the way she was often quiet, not empty, but full of something that had not yet decided to become words. Then she said, "Your species is unusual. We hear that frequently. I mean it differently from how most species mean it," she said. "You did not have enough to win, but you considered yourself a participant anyway. I did not have a good response to that. because it had not occurred to me to consider any other approach. When a problem exists, you work the problem. You find the angle it has not found yet. You make yourself a variable it has not accounted for. That is not courage exactly. It is simply the way forward. The tow to Velthos station took 11 hours. 11 hours of my ship's engine running hotter than its specifications recommended, while I hand flew the trajectory because the autopilot could not model the long hauler's irregular mass distribution accurately enough to be trusted. My hands cramped on the controls. I ate a protein bar that tasted like cardboard, pressed into the shape of optimism. Sable cleared stress alerts as fast as she could, and let me know, with admirable calm, which ones I should worry about, and which ones I should accept as the cost of the current situation. At hour 8, Velthara came to the bridge and sat in the co-pilot seat. There was nothing she could do to help, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise. She simply sat there, present and still, watching the stars and the readouts with equal attention. It took me a little while to understand that this was not idleness. For a Keithali, I would come to learn, bearing witness to the cost of a thing is itself a form of respect. She was not watching me fly. She was acknowledging that flying cost something, and she considered it important to see that clearly. After a long while, she said quietly, "No one answered our beacon. 37 hours. No one came." "I know," I said. "You came by accident." Sable caught the signal. I chose to listen. Both parts matter, I think. She was quiet again. And then, in a tone I had not heard from her before, something softer than calculation, something that she seemed to choose carefully, she said, "Thank you." 2 words, simply said. No decoration, just the truth, stated precisely. We came into Velthas station at the end of hour 11, with my engine throwing a stress reading that I labeled in terms I will not repeat here. There was a medical team waiting. There was also a compact liaison with a data slate and the expression of someone who has found a paperwork error and considers it their purpose to document it thoroughly. He found me before I had fully cleared my own airlock. He went through my authorization boundary, my sector incursion, my interaction with the raider skiffs, and several other items in a tone of careful bureaucratic concern. I was 31 hours awake and in no particular mood, but I also understood that he was doing a job, so I answered his questions honestly and waited. What ended the conversation was Selly. She walked past the medical team, past the liaison, directly to me, and held out one hand with the palm facing upward, the Chethali gesture for offering, and said, in clear compact standard, so that everyone present could hear every word, "My mother says you are owed a debt." Velthara came to stand beside her and said nothing. She simply looked at the compact liaison with an expression that communicated, without any ambiguity, that the conversation about authorization paperwork was finished. The liaison looked at his data slate. He made a note. He stepped back. I stayed at Velta station for 2 weeks while my ship was repaired. On the day I left, Selly came to the docking port and gave me a folded piece of actual paper. I still do not know where she found it on a space station, with a list of questions written in careful, even handwriting. It was long. It covered the history of human adhesive technology, whether humans dreamed, whether I had siblings, and many other topics of apparently urgent interest. At the very bottom, in slightly smaller writing, was one final question. How do you decide when to come when someone calls? I folded the paper and put it in my pocket and told her I would answer all of them next time. She asked if I promised. I looked at her serious, wide eyes and thought about 37 hours and 4 ships and a debris field and a calculation that only worked because I had not stopped running it. "Yes," I said, "I promise." I walked back to my ship. I ran my checks. I plotted my course home. And then I turned the background scanner back on. The one Sable runs quietly beneath everything else, listening to the spaces between signals. And I let it run. Because that is what you do when you know what kind of person you are. You keep the scanner on. You drink your coffee. You wait.